How are you?
Good. How you doing, John?
Yeah, pretty good.
Hey,
Good.
John. Hey,
Hi.
Dr. Brown.
Hi. I'm Mary.
All right. Just getting set up here. Okay. All right.
You're not driving tonight.
No, 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 no. Fortunately, I was home today, so I didn't have to do my commute today. So it was good. Um, yeah. Are you coming to the gala, Mary?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Have you
That's
have you
just
been to it before?
last year I graduated.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So
Finally.
you and I have met then, right? I'm sorry. I,
Yes.
I met like
Yes.
1,000 people then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. All right.
That's this weekend, right?
Yes. It's this Saturday.
Okay.
What is this Saturday? What's going on?
The
Uh,
gala.
the we do every year we do a gala dinner, but we also do the graduation at the same time as that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you'll get invited when you graduate, John.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's yeah.
Do I wear my own regalia from my PhD?
Yeah. Yes. You get to walk and everything.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there'll be a dinner afterwards, and then there'll be a speech and all that.
All right.
Yeah,
It's a nice time.
yeah,
Yeah, it sounds. Well, this will be my second master's, so it's not that I haven't walked. Well, it's
right,
plus I
right.
got my PhD, so it's not. I probably would go just to meet everybody.
Yeah, yeah, that would be good. So it's not that far for you either. You just have to come down. You could come down on on the Acela or whatever.
Where is it held?
Well, this year, same as last year, we had it having it at the JP2 Center in Washington.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
The chapel there is absolutely beautiful.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Yeah, I can bring my wife with me, and then we can go down and go visit my sister-in-law, Virginia.
Oh, where in Virginia?
Outside Richmond, Chester.
Oh, okay. Well, I have a couple questions left over from last week's discussion.
Yeah, go for it.
One is is the dating of Matthew, and is it now more accepted that it was before 70? Because I know Heather's answer had the more like the 80 and referred to the story of the vineyard, the vine, and the killing of the son,
Yeah.
and the burning that man's city, as a thing that the temple had been already destroyed. And I know I've heard it both ways, but which is more accepted at this point?
That's a really good question. I don't know that there's a whole lot of new debate on that topic because I think we're kind of at a stalemate. So I think if you were to check, most, critical commentaries done in Matthew in the last 10 years, my suspicion would be almost all of them would push for a post 70 AD date. Now, you might get some conservative arguments for pre 70 dating. I think that's possible. Personally, I think if you were to make an argument and you had no big ideological stake in the outcome, like for instance, you didn't want to make Matthew earlier as part of the whole agenda of making Matthew earlier than Mark, and that's sometimes it's tied up with that. So you will get people sometimes arguing that, but I think you can make a much stronger argument for Mark being pre-70 than Matthew. The reason I would put Matthew later is it's not so much because the prophecies are more vivid, although that might be part of it. It's I think Matthew himself signals that he's post 70 AD, and the reason I think that is how he handles the temple oracle, in the temple saying in the temple charge in the Passion narrative. If you compare closely Matthew's handling of the temple charge, where the religious authorities accused Jesus of claiming that he would destroy the temple and raise it again in 3 days.
Uh-huh.
In the Markan account, Mark tells us that the two witnesses don't agree, and so basically Mark chalks it up to false testimony on the part of the accusers, because the two witnesses don't agree. Therefore the testimony doesn't have legal weight. Whereas with Matthew, if you look at Matthew's version, the witnesses do agree. And that's kind of interesting. So my suspicion of what actually happened was that there was a saying by Jesus on, historically, about the temple being destroyed and raised again in 3 days. And it was sort of cryptic, and it was a bit of a riddle. And it wasn't at all clear like what he meant by it until years after the fact.
Uh-huh.
Because is he talking about himself rising from the dead? Okay, but what does it have to do with the temple being destroyed? Because the temple wasn't destroyed, obviously, till much, much after the resurrection. So if you were to have written a gospel prior to the temple being destroyed, how would you have handled that temple saying? You would not have really wanted it to Jesus to take full ownership of it. You would have wanted to imply that, well, it's something that his enemy said he said, but we're not saying he did say it.
Okay.
So that seemed to be how Mark handles it. On the other hand, Matthew clearly seems to be more willing that we should accept the saying, the charge as being true, because the two witnesses did agree legally. Now, maybe the witnesses are lying, but Mark doesn't, or Matthew doesn't lead us to believe that. So what I suspect happened is that the saying became more plausible that the church would really agree to make Jesus the owner of the saying after the temple was gone, even though Matthew did not explain how the destruction of the temple and the resurrection are actually related. That remains sort of unexplained, and that may well be how John picked it up in John chapter 2, because John actually does put the saying explicitly on the lips of Jesus, but at the beginning of the gospel, and then clearly, John makes the identification, well, he was speaking when he did this of the temple of his body. And then, John doesn't really explicitly tell us it had anything to do with the Jerusalem temple being destroyed, but John clearly is presupposing this, and I think we can assume that because of where he puts his that saying at the very beginning. That the temple cleansing happens at the beginning, though in a certain sense, we're already moving and doing theology with a purely post-temple outlook, which is why the equivalence can be made much more explicitly that Jesus is now the temple, his body's a temple, and he's in effect replacing whatever function the temple had before. So now we've sort of have squared the circle and have explained it. So the saying is historical, almost certainly, right? And but it's one of those sayings that probably took the church a while to explain fully. So that's why I think Matthew is probably post-temple. But I think you could make an argument pre-temple too, and obviously some people do.
Yeah, because both the Navarre and the Scott Hahn, the Ignatius, both put it at pre-70. But Jerome biblical commentary puts it after.
Yeah. What are the arguments that Scott gives? Does he give arguments? Or is it just the idea that he's really uncomfortable with the post-70 dating because
Let me pull it out because I have it. Oh, wait a minute. That's the Navarre.
I mean, Petrie, I think, was along those lines. Petrie came out with that book, and I think one of the things that he wanted to show was that the prophecies are reliable. So if we're sort of undermining, his view, undermining the reliability of Jesus's prophecies about the coming of the kingdom in Matthew 24 and 25, if we date them to after the temple, but.
Well, here's what it says. It says the Pontifical Biblical Commission instituted by Pope Leo XIII.
Yeah.
Said concluded in 1911 that the original blah 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 was probably written before 70. It says this conclusion finds support within the gospel itself. For example, it is Matthew's normal procedure to point out how past events have enduring significance for the church in his day, and then he quotes 27:8 and 28:15. Since Matthew records Jesus' Olivet Discourse foretelling the temple's destruction, chapter 24 and then 22:7, one might also expect references to the fulfillment of this pivotal event had this gospel been written after the fact. As it is, Matthew is silent regarding the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. Presumably the temple was still standing and Jesus' words were unfulfilled at the time he wrote his gospel.
Okay, so he basically had three arguments there. So the first argument is the Pontifical Biblical Commission. But that one I think we can dispense with pretty quickly because as we showed...
Because at that time that was...
Yeah, exactly. So the Pontifical Biblical Commission at the turn of the 20th century, took very, very sort of anti-modernist decisions, and that was that was part and parcel of the church's posture then. Not even under Leo, but really under Pius Pius X. That was sort of the high watermark of biblical traditionalism. Now, again, maybe that's a good argument, maybe it's not. But the thing is, you can very easily see that the church no longer considers those responsa binding. And the easiest way to see it is in the material for this week when you read. I think I have it this week or maybe next week when we read Pope Benedict's. He was Cardinal Ratzinger then, but his 1993 address to the PBC made it really clear that the approach of the magisterium in the previous part of the 20th century was not the approach in the second half of the 20th century, and there were good reasons for that. So I mean it's. So I think it's a little disingenuous for them to continue to bring up these PBC responsa, as implying that the church has really rendered a sort of a permanent judgment on this, when in fact, nobody in the field takes it that way, and the magisterium itself has really pointed us in the other direction. So that's one argument. The second argument is. May or may not be true, right? You could take it, I think, either way, right? Yes, it is possible that Matthew was written before the temple was destroyed. I mean, I wouldn't dogmatically insist on it either way. I think I think you could argue it either way. But the third argument is that the old J.A.T. Robinson, the dog that did not bark argument, and that's what Robinson argued, and he's not citing Robinson here, but that's where he's getting it from. Robinson basically wanted to argue the whole New Testament was pre-70 A.D., and the reason we know that is that nowhere does the New Testament refer to the temple being destroyed. Right. Yeah, okay, maybe, but why would we expect the New Testament, if the Gospels are about the life of Jesus, why would we expect them to tell us about the temple being destroyed? That's an event that happened later. So again, I think you could take the absence of evidence there as not necessarily being the evidence of absence, or the evidence of absence not being the absence of evidence. The fact that the temple is not mentioned there, I don't necessarily think cuts either way.
Okay.
That's just my own view. I mean, and that argument probably comes up more often when you're talking about the Book of Acts, because as we know, the Book of Acts also does not mention the temple being destroyed.
Yeah.
So there is an argument to be made that Acts should be dated prior to 70 AD, because if it had not been, it would have showed us the death of Peter and Paul before, and of course that pushes Luke, probably earlier than Acts, because Luke is said to be the first volume. So obviously you can make an argument there, but I think the pushback is fairly obvious that if Luke had wanted to show us the death of Peter and Paul, if he had done that, it would have really implied in the second volume that the death of Peter and Paul were somehow equivalent to the death of Jesus. In other words, that would really be the denouement of that gospel. And I don't think that Luke himself necessarily would have wanted to end the story in that way. With the death of two other people who are important in the church, but clearly are not the same historically as the death of, they're not inaugurating a new age. In other words,
Right.
They're just two martyrs within the existing age of the church. So I mean, I think, if you were a careful author and you did not want to give the impression that the death of the death of Peter and Paul were themselves significant in terms of a new age, then you wouldn't have wanted to record them anyway, because there's so many parallels between Luke and Acts. That would be a natural conclusion that you have almost two semi-messiahs dying at the end of the second volume, and their death is in some way parallel to Jesus's. In which case, that would have interesting implications theologically. I think you'd agree, right? It would make Peter and Paul in some ways much greater in the tradition even than they are, and maybe even greater than we really want them to be. So I don't know. I mean, I think if you think about it a lot, you can come up with good reasons why Luke would not have wanted to do that.
Okay.
So
I
again,
never really thought about it that way, but yeah.
What's that?
I never really thought about it that way, that would sort of increase Peter and Paul's sort of their prominence or whatever. But
yeah, I mean, they're already extremely prominent in the gospel in Acts, right? In some ways, Acts is really the Acts of Peter in the first half and the Acts of Paul in the second half.
Right.
And to have an ending that looks suspiciously like the Gospel of Luke might sort of give the wrong idea, and okay. I don't know. I don't think. I think it would have kind of weird conclusions that I think would be a little difficult for us to anticipate. But I think maybe that's a reason Luke wouldn't have wanted to do that. And so that explains why Luke could have been writing in 85 AD and still decided to end the gospel. Not even at Paul's death or Peter's death, but maybe somewhat before that. So, obviously why Acts ends the way it does is itself kind of a mystery. It does sort of end in a little bit of an anticlimax, but I think there's a lot of interesting interpretations of that ending. That really for us to see that perhaps that this is Luke's own adaptation of Paul's own idea that you have this sort of drama in the gospel about this whole question of Israel. Luke handles Israel very interestingly. Luke is in some way the most pro Israel, the most pro-national Israel of all the gospel writers. It's very much embedded in his gospel with these patriotic, speeches and songs that the characters sing in the very beginning. there's a lot of symbolism of the 12 that really is much more drawn out in Luke than it is in the others. But you do see at the very first half where Peter and the disciples, are trying to really establish themselves around the temple and the centrality of the temple, just as Jesus had done in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus was spending a lot of time teaching in the temple. That was sort of the thing that eventually led to his death and execution and resurrection. But you see the same thing, the struggle for the temple in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Acts. But then, they basically give up on the temple, and then they start moving outward to Judea and to Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And then you also see the admission of the Gentiles in Acts 10. But then in Acts 13, Paul, is spending a lot of time in the very beginning trying to preach in the synagogues. But then he basically says, look, you guys have rejected this, forget you all. I'm going to preach to the Gentiles from here on out. But what's ironic is he doesn't actually do that. I mean, he does spend a lot of time with the Gentiles, but there's still a lot of interactions between him and Jews after that. So, the whole kind of paradox of the Gentile mission and the fate of Israel, which Paul himself brings out, in Romans 9, 10, and 11, the sort of paradoxical mission of Israel and what that is maybe Luke's way of telling that. And, the idea with the ending of Acts being this sort of, replay of that Isaiah quote and stuff like that is very suggestive of Luke really wanting to end on this paradox that there may be eventually this time of acceptance of the gospel by Israel in the future. This whole idea of the second chance and the big Lucan theme of repentance and coming back, and that when that happens, that's going to be the ending. So the Luke sort of leaves the reader to sort of tease that out, I think. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
So yeah, I mean, I think you can
there's a
argue
lot
it,
to digest,
obviously.
but I'll get it a little bit.
If you're interested in the dating question, J.T. Robinson is a book you probably should know, because he's someone who, wrote he's not a particularly conservative scholar, ironically, but he wrote a kind of I won't say it's super influential, but it definitely caused a splash of kind of an argument that's really a restatement about other things, arguing that the whole New Testament is pre-temple, but I think it's probably safer to argue post-temple for Matthew.
Okay.
I would definitely argue John is post-temple. I think the evidence is really overwhelming in John for post-temple. Luke, I think could probably go either way, but I would lean post-temple for him as well.
Okay.
I kind of agree with the Robinson.
You agree with the pre-temple?
Yeah, I think most of all of this pre-temple. There's just too many places where it would be obvious that the temple wasn't there, and it's written as if it was still being in use, and especially like Hebrews, the temple's still being used.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
Luke and Acts. I mean, there's too many places where it's referenced Paul going to the temple, and
right.
I think it ended the way it ended because that's where it ended for Luke.
Yeah,
with Paul.
That could
I think
be.
we're reading too much into what was actually being done.
Yeah, that could be.
We can make, it's like the old saying, you can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say instead of let it say what it is saying.
Right.
Yeah,
what do you think about John?
I'm kind of in the middle with John, although I probably could see it being written pre-temple also, only because if you look at Revelation, even because I give Revelation a late date, but a lot of what's indicated in Revelation
Right.
is actually hasn't happened yet. And as far as the
right
implications of who was John really indicating as the false prophet, who was dealing actually with Rome and making deals with her. I mean, we can see that in the Gospels,
Right.
who cooperated with Rome. I don't know. I
Yeah.
I just have a feeling a lot of it was written beforehand and may have gotten, as scribes do, rewrite things.
It's possible. Yeah. I actually would. I think it's true. I think you can make a stronger case for Revelation being pre-70 than you could for the Gospel John being pre-70.
Yeah.
Even though that's not usually how it's dated. I think the biggest problem with putting John pre-70 is that the eschatology is just so radically different. It just wouldn't make sense theologically to write a gospel where there's so much realized eschatology if the temple is still standing there, and that I think is the biggest issue. Like there's so much of a theme of in John of replacement, where there's Jesus seems to be replacing the temple.
Mm-hmm.
He seems to be replacing the Passover. He seems to be replacing the Feast of Booths in John 7. He seems to be replacing the Feast of Lights in John 10. All of these things make sense and furthermore, salvation is more of an imminent reality. Judgment is more of not an imminent reality, a more present reality. Judgment is a present reality. He says he has passed from death to life. The judgment has already happened for some people. So there's no future prophecies in the gospel about fiery judgment. Suggesting that something happened within the time period to occasion a revision of the eschatological outlook that you see in like Mark. Like Mark is very eschatological, right? That there's a really strong theme in Mark of the time has been fulfilled. The very beginning, the kingdom of God is at hand. It's coming. It's breaking in now. That's the central message you get in Mark and Matthew and Luke, but you never get any kingdom sayings like that in John. Jesus never says in John the kingdom is at hand. The presupposition is the kingdom's already here. And in fact, what you have in John is, a lot of really strong allusions to sacraments, as those sacraments are sort of a present reality. You have Jesus baptizing in John. You have Jesus witnessing baptisms in John. You have Jesus giving a Last Supper discourse. It's sort of in a way that almost would imply that there's a certain amount of knowledge on the part of the audience at that time about what's going on already. So having a much more vivid sacramentalism also would imply not necessarily a post-temple dating, but definitely more realized eschatology that you would associate with being post-temple. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's easier. Obviously, there are arguments for John being pre-temple too.
Yeah.
And usually, what they revolve around are little things like, where they John 5:2 I think uses present tense, where he says there is a sheep's gate. Implying the sheep's gate is still standing, which is something that was there when the temple was still there. So
right.
Yeah.
And his saying we have with the Samaritan woman.
But the Samaritan woman again is presupposes a replacement of temple worship altogether, right? So he says neither this mountain nor the Gerizim doesn't matter, Jerusalem doesn't matter. It's really all who are going to worship the Father in spirit and truth, implying that Jesus, that the temple really is the old discussion where the temple should be has been relativized. Well, it's easier to come to that conclusion in a world where the temple doesn't exist anymore, than when one where it does.
Yeah.
So that's all I'm saying. So yeah, I would pretty strongly argue for John being post 70, but I think the other gospels could be argued either way. I would lean against 70 for Matthew and Luke, for the reason I said. But I think you could take it either way.
And you lean, I mean, for sure, Mark being first, are you on?
I would give you
Not
probably,
necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily, but probably. Yeah. I don't. I don't necessarily think it's good to always buck the consensus. It's fine to buck the consensus, but you should have really good reasons for doing it. And I think that the arguments for Mark being earlier are, pretty overwhelming. Now, I think in a way, what I tell students if we were studying the synoptic, and when we do the synoptic course, which we're developing now, I'm going to tell students to make sure they understand, the idea of mark and priority is really more of a model than it is an historical fact. The truth is we don't really know how these gospels actually got to be what they are. And the idea that Mark could have been assembled from itself, from really earlier fragments that ended up also in Matthew, which would imply a much more complex compositional structure than even the fairly complicated one of the two source solution of the synoptic problem. The two source is probably a reasonably good, simple enough to be applicable approximation of what happened, but it definitely does not explain all the problems. In terms of the relationship between the three gospels. And I think most sophisticated analysts will tell you that what really happened historically is probably more complex than the most complicated theory that we have. And yeah, so on the other hand, looking at Matthew as a redaction of Mark seems a reasonably good approximation of it seems a reasonably good explanation of what Matthew is. Looking at Luke in the same way seems a reasonably good approximation of what Luke is. Looking at Mark as a synthesis of Matthew and Luke really does not make a lot of sense. If that were the case, that Mark synthesized Matthew and Luke, what was Mark even trying to accomplish? I mean, that really that I think is the biggest problem with the traditional, not even the traditional, but the Griesbachian view. If you really think Mark was abridging Matthew, then I think we'd really have to look at the gospel as kind of a failure, because it really did not influence church history all that much. Church history would not have been a whole lot different if there were no Gospel of Mark. Very little unique theology came from it, whereas you can see there's a lot of really important things that came from each of the other three Gospels that, you could imagine the church would be very different if it were lacking. So, I think in some ways, explaining Mark as the first gospel is probably the best way of explaining how and why it's still part of the canon, because then you actually have something to explain there. You actually have, what Mark was trying to do, which is just write down the preaching and the tradition of Peter and coming up with the idea of a written gospel. I mean, his gospel starts out saying, this is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then going through and having, a gospel. The concept of gospel in the form that it exists, would be his invention. And so that's a very important contribution and looked at in that way. But, how important is his contribution if it's just a synthesis of Mark or Matthew and Luke? It's almost like the accidental gospel in a way, I think.
Okay.
So I don't know. That's my opinion. What do you think?
I think I'd have to read a whole lot more and study a whole lot more before I'd figure it out.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Um,
Dr. Brown. Yeah, it's Rick. I just thought
Hi, Rick.
regarding about the whole issue of whether the synoptics were written before or after the temple. Could it be that tradition obviously started before the temple might have become established so that certain events after a certain period would not be included anymore, even something like the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
And so when they wrote down the tradition, it didn't leave room for insertions even of a cataclysmic event like the temple destruction.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. That if you kind of look at the tradition, almost everyone would acknowledge that the Passion narrative is the oldest part of the gospel tradition, and it's the one in which the variations between the gospels in some ways are the smallest in terms of like the order of events, but there's a lot of variation with language and literary details, suggesting that what you don't have is as much redaction as you do, like you have an oral tradition that's relatively fixed. Okay. And it's not the kind of thing that they really could have cleaned up a lot if they had even wanted to. And so you get stories that where there's different details and stuff, but there's really not an obvious theological motive as to why the story should be different, as though one took one story and made some changes to it, and then here it comes out differently. You do see some of that in the Passion, but not as much. And so, yeah, I think that's right. I think that the stuff that happened afterwards in the church was just not part of the Jesus tradition, and the destruction of the temple would clearly belong to that. Like, where would you have put the destruction of the temple in the gospel if you were to have written it? I mean, would you have sort of closed on that line in the Gospel of Matthew, maybe, but by saying, at the end, "Lo, I've been with you till the end of the age." Oh yes, and by the way, the age has ended in 70 AD when the temple got destroyed, or do you sort of leave that question of the end of the age sort of more open that way by not referencing it? And where would it have been inserted? That's the question.
There was in one of our earlier weeks, there was a reference to a modern study of how oral tradition was passed on among Semitic peoples, and they did say that they were pretty rigid and accurate to avoid unauthorized changes. So
right.
Really,
yeah, that's something we're going to look at a little bit more in week 13. I guess is it next week or this week?
Yeah.
Next week.
Next week, yeah. So we'll be looking at week 13 at the issue of oral tradition again, and I was going to share with you some kind of exciting, what I think are fairly exciting discoveries, written by a guy who actually, as opposed to the form critics who had this sort of rigid model of how stories developed, with this sort of Boltzmann laws of traditional, handing down tradition stuff. But this guy actually just spent decades living in the Middle East among Semitic peoples, very like the kind of people that would have witnessed the Jesus tradition first, and just witnessed how they told stories. And so he wrote what became a very, very important article on that, even though it wasn't really noticed for a while at first. And then Balcom kind of took that and sort of ran with it. So I think that there's some really interesting work, again, looking at the Gospels in terms of storytelling tradition, and seeing how what you find in the Gospels actually is what you would expect. you know, if there in fact were an oral tradition in play. And so,
Well,
you know,
does-
the names, for instance, are very important. This is something that's going to come out as well, because the names, you know, Balcom really does a brilliant job arguing, in my opinion, that the names that you see just sort of casually dropped in some of the stories, not all of them, but some of them, especially the earliest version. Mark is the one who uses the most of the names, suggesting, by the way, that he really is closest to the oral tradition. That the names of the people given are the people who were known in the early church, and they were the ones who could vouch for the basic accuracy of the story. So, for instance, in Mark's detail alone of Cyrus of Cyrene, you know, the one who was sort of pressed into service to carry Jesus' cross, Mark alone tells us about Alexander and Rufus. Why? Why does he tell us about Alexander and Rufus being the sons of Cyrene? Why would anyone care about that? I mean, they're just names. But the reason they would have mattered is that, you know, if Simon is no longer around, they would be the ones who would be trusted with telling the story about Dad's brush with greatness, you know, in Jesus's final walk to Calvary. And so this very important story in the history of the church, you know, is basically vouchsafed by, you know, by two people who knew the guy, who were direct relatives of the guy who was there. So, you know, similarly, Bartholomew, the man whom Jesus healed on the road from Jericho, his name's only given in Mark. It's not given in the other Gospels, you know, implying that, you know, this is a real person. This is a real person. Bartholomew of Jericho, the person whom Jesus healed, is someone who remembered that one particular aspect of the tradition and would be the person who you'd go to if you wanted to hear that story again. So the names themselves, you know, Balcom argues, are actually probably very important. And the way the names appear in the Gospels are very, very important also. It's interesting, he points out, and this is something that you never notice on your own. I never noticed this, but in Mark's Gospel, the first character of the 12 who are with Jesus from the beginning mentioned is Peter, and he's also the last person mentioned. Okay, you know, and he shows us that there's this ancient technique of eyewitness inclusio, where if you want to basically imply who the person is who stands behind the story, for the most part, now not everything in the Gospel of Mark could Peter have witnessed, but for the most part, what he witnessed is the before and after, the beginning and the end. And so, and that's really interesting too. You see the same thing in the Gospel of John. The first character mentioned in the Gospel of John is the beloved disciple. The last person mentioned is the other disciple, the beloved disciple. So just like John says, the beloved disciple is whoever this is the witness to these particular stories. He's the person who can certify their authenticity. And that would account for why there's so much unique material in the Gospel of John. You know, you'd need to establish who the person is who's relaying this information, because clearly there's a different source than the Peter, James, and John source that seems to be behind so much of what the Synoptics report. So it's a very interesting book. I hope you guys like it. You may not have time to finish it for this course, but put it on your lifelong reading list, because it's a really, really good book. And there's a lot of interesting articles.
So what is the book?
It's Richard Balcom's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. That's
okay.
Yeah.
That we've got.
So it's not sort of a naive eyewitness account, which holds that Matthew's running around writing down what he saw, and the Gospels, his memoirs and stuff. No, I mean it builds on modern scholarly consensus about Matthew's dependence on Mark and that sort of thing, and the likely, but there is at the same time a very conservative view given on the authenticity of Mark's gospel as truly a reflection of the preaching of Peter and the memories of Saint Peter. And so Peter is by far the most frequently mentioned, as a percentage of the whole gospel in Mark than he is in all the other gospels. So that seems like it's something defensible. So anyway, it's a very interesting book. I hope you guys like it.
I particularly like his survey of the frequency of names.
Yeah.
In the time of Christ,
Right.
and how it matched almost exactly the frequency of the names in the Gospels. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And you see that ancient or first century Jews were not very unique in their choice of names. There are a lot of people named Simon. There are a lot of people named John. There are a lot of people named Mary or some version of Mary. So, they have ways of telling the difference between them. And so typically they would have resorted to nicknames, the names of the father, the name of profession perhaps, or name of city of origin. So, so these are actually really useful to help to distinguish between characters in the Gospels that might be easily to be conflatable, but you probably shouldn't be.
On the whole idea of oral tradition and how that plays in, we're sort of talking about the dating and that whole kind of thing, and why they wouldn't have put in the temple destruction if it had already happened. And if it did come from oral tradition, and the people were used to it being told a certain way, be a little bit like how Augustine's people got really mad about, Augustine got mad at Jerome over he was going to change things, because people are used to the way they hear things, and it's like, don't mess with the tradition. Is there any of that?
Exactly. So
Okay.
So Rick sounds like he's read the book. So Rick, you remember when he talks about informal controlled tradition? So basically, if you with certain kinds of stories that are really vital to the people's identity, you can't. First of all, you're not allowed to tell a story at all until you've sort of reached a point at which you've heard the story enough times that you can be trusted. You've got to be tradition before you can actually relay the tradition yourself.
Absolutely.
So that's rule number one. Second thing is, you can't, tendentiously add, new elements to the story or radically change kind of core elements of the story to sort of advance something brand new. So that's not something that can be done. On the other hand, you can definitely alter peripheral details. I mean, that's not a problem. So if you want to change peripheral details about, say, where the story took place, it's not important to the story. The exact falling out of the words of the story, those are types of variations that can be permitted. So there's a certain amount of flexibility, as you might expect, within a storytelling tradition. Each told story is itself a new performance. So it relates to the way the story's been given in the past, but it's not so rigidly fixed that you can't change anything. Okay. Yeah. On the other hand, the longer it's being told, probably, if anything, the more conservative it gets in terms of the inability to alter key details. So,
the other thing, I guess, is that the community would actually expect the story to be told a certain way, much like, for instance, in today's audiences. They expect a certain popular song to be rendered with the exact words, with not so much variation. Otherwise, they might not. It might not. Yeah. So there's a certain expectation expectation of the community formed by tradition itself that would obviate random and arbitrary changes.
Right, right. Oh, well, or I could say non-random and non-arbitrary changes that really
Yeah,
are trying to fundamentally, introduce something brand new into the tradition that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
I remember like 2 years ago at our parish, we had a music director, and it was Advent, and so there's obviously the traditional "O come, Emmanuel," "O come,"
Yeah.
everyone knows that one, but there's like a whole bunch of other versions of this, and so their idea was every single week they do a different version of "O come, Emmanuel," and so it was just terrible.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Except it was terrible, huh? People didn't like it.
No, they hated it. At least I hated it. I don't know if what other people's reaction was, but I couldn't stand it. And I still remembered it like a couple years later and stuff. Now I still think about it.
How not to sing at Mass during Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. There's just a certain way that the song is supposed to go. I don't mind composing a new song, but why would you want to change an old song? That's the question.
Well, because there's so many. Well, there's so many hymns that have many, 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 many tunes that people aren't familiar with. So, yeah.
Well, or the reverse. You have tunes that have many, many different, sets of words that can be said.
And both are true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Traditionalist, huh?
Yeah, well, not really, but yeah, I just I do think that there is something to be said for not changing things for change's sake and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
I don't I don't know. I've kind of gone back and forth about it because I was around when I went to Steubenville. Obviously, Steubenville is not. It is a conservative place, but it's not a super traditionalist place in that it's very charismatic.
Right.
There's there's praise and worship music. They do traditional things like Eucharistic adoration, but they do them in ways that are kind of non-traditional. Like, they'll be sort of praise and worship. It'll be a kind of a charismatic Eucharistic adoration, if you can think of those things. And it seems to work for them. On the other hand, and so, I used to think, well, we really should be much more traditional. But, at the same time, it's kind of like, well, this seems to work. Why is it for me to say that, no, it would be better if we really had stuck with something much older? But what's interesting is that, ironically, Franciscan is starting to get a little more traditional. They've a lot of younger people, it seems, and I've just heard a lot of anecdotal evidence. I don't have a lot of hard survey data on this, but they seem to be much more drawn to the older forms. And there's a Latin Mass there now that is more attended than the their praise and worship Mass. So and I found that to be pretty surprising.
Mm-hmm.
I was there like 10, 12 years ago, and I was unaware that there even was a Latin Mass community. I gather there was one. It's not a new thing, but it's gotten fairly prominent. So so a lot of the younger kids, it seems like there is to some degree the older culture is kind of is in its own way reasserting itself. They've been deprived of the traditional music. They've been deprived of the beautiful churches. They've been deprived of a lot of the things that, were taken for granted, up until the 50s and 60s.
Yep.
And, there is desire to have some of them back, I think.
Yep.
So at any rate.
I have a question.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I have a question about the lecture,
Sure.
for this week. It's
yet.
under the PBC's interpretation of the Bible and the Church.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you wrote, as you skim through chapter 1, do note all the different methods used today, especially the one you are least disposed to ideologically. You might think there is nothing good to come from Marxist liberationists or feminist modes of interpretation, but I submit to you that there can be, for in both cases, unconscious biases of being in the early 21st century American can blind one to the reality that the Bible lends less than unqualified support to modern capitalism or modern conceptions of gender issues.
Oh yeah.
So, give me an example of what I don't
The
understand
capitalism
exactly
one is
what
a
you
slam
mean.
dunk, right? I mean, look at how they behave in Acts. They're sharing their property. They're giving each other. They're living communally and stuff. So I mean, it's I mean, the idea that that there's a lot of support for the idea of what we've come to believe as the absolute right of people to keep their money privately and that sort of thing is I don't see that. I mean, is that really in the Bible? I mean, is the free market economics? I mean, apart from what we should do now in our society, obviously there is a difference of time there and space, but in terms of yeah, there's just so many things about our economy today that's the notion of an economy that's really fundamentally different than how they would have thought of that in their particular time. And in some ways, I think we should probably take a step or two back and maybe re-examine some of our assumptions with regard to that. Now, the gender thing I probably would not have written because today. Obviously, that whole transgender thing was not even on the radar screen. When I wrote this course, probably 6-7 years ago. So I wasn't definitely talking about transgender stuff, if that's what you thought. But
yeah, I wasn't sure where you were going with that.
But yeah. So I think I will change that actually. Now that you brought that to my attention.
Feminism is one thing. Transgender.
Yeah. So what I was thinking about is that there is an element in the Gospels that is a little subversive of hierarchies, and so there clearly is in the Gospels, an effort to convey, and this all clearly goes back to Jesus historically. Obviously, you can imagine a Messiah who was standoffish toward women and didn't like poor people all that much, right? Neither of those things are really necessarily part of the job description, but the fact that women had such an important role in his ministry and his inner circle, although not necessarily strictly as part of the 12 in Luke, is I think something that maybe we haven't taken full note of, in terms of roles in society, roles in the church, that kind of thing. So that's all I would say there. And I'm not stealthily advocating women's ordination or anything like that. I'm just saying that that the role of women is probably or put it this way. Let me to get back to your original question. If you were to read, say, feminist exegesis from the past 5 or 10 years, you probably could learn a thing or two of assumptions about the ways that we've read the text that may not be as solid historically as you would think. Yeah.
And what is wrong with modern capitalism?
What's wrong with modern capitalism? Well, where do you want me to start?
Because compared to things in common that the communists had that didn't seem to work for the last 150 years.
That's right. So if we're talking
including Thanksgiving, by the way, the first Thanksgiving was a communal affair which didn't work out. It wasn't.
Oh, right. You've listened to Rush Limbaugh too, huh? We talked about
that's way before. That's way before Rush Limbaugh. That's historic.
Well,
it doesn't work. Why should I work as hard as somebody else and contribute as much? It doesn't. The
Well,
doesn't come,
that's
work.
that's sort of the question, right? I mean, there is in the gospel a reversion of a rejection of hierarchy, right? And there is an exaltation of humility and service. And so, how we would actually put that into play now, I think, is obviously a little ticklish question, but
Well, I think you're looking at a government that's run by a theocracy
yeah.
that won't really happen until Christ comes back. One can be humble, and I know a few who are run businesses that hire people and take care of them,
right,
and provide jobs, as opposed to those who do the same. There are obviously bad people in both areas. There are people who take away from others. But why should somebody who is taking the bigger risk, as far as being an entrepreneur and providing jobs, get paid less than the one who's, or the same as the one who's taking out the garbage? I don't see the
you're asking a really specific question here, and all I was really saying was that in terms of like incentives and who should get paid what, and what the relative of merits of the claims of labor versus the claims of capital. These are all sort of interesting questions and stuff, but just going back to the way the early church, or first of all, the sayings of Jesus regarding money, and I'm not just talking even about the sayings about the rich man, but the criticisms of wealth acquisition, of the warnings of the dangers of too much money, the urging to be satisfied with what you have. There is in Luke, I would say especially, a pretty strong critique against a lot of the sort of casual attitudes we have today, sort of assimilated as being not only inevitable but unchallengeable, about the idea that there has to be incentives to make society work. Again, I guess I'm just sort of less than getting into a political economy discussion, which we certainly could have over a beer if you like.
I'm just saying. Well, you're making a point here to support. This is what you're saying, so I'm challenging it on that.
There's clearly, and I'd say in the Bible as a whole, that there's clearly an anti-finance ethos. I mean, the idea of having an economy that's so dependent on borrowing and lending, would have been just absolutely unthinkable to an ancient an ancient economy. Borrowing and lending is just not something you do in a society in which people could very easily be reduced to a form of debt servitude if they borrowed. If they borrowed at all, because if they borrowed at all, then what are the odds they're ever going to be able to pay you back? If they're too poor to be able to pay their bills now, it would certainly be too poor to pay them back. So.
No, I agree with that. I'm not saying that in itself is right. Right. But I mean, God works on incentives. If we didn't have incentives, what's the point?
Does God work on incentives? Well,
of course he does.
Do you think?
Sort of.
Of course he does. Why are we doing this? What is the whole purpose? If we don't have an incentive because we want to become closer to God by growth. And earning, as the Catholic Church says, earning our merits, growing our merits,
right,
and so forth. I mean, this is incentives to do things. Otherwise, what's the point? Just go to church. Explain it to me. You're going, Mary. You're saying that. Explain to me why there isn't some sort of
What-
incentive.
Incentive is he made me to know him and love him and serve him, and that's incentive enough. Is not. I mean, it's just God is love. It's not like I'm doing this to get something.
Right.
Exactly.
But you're doing it out of love because you want to
That's
grow
not.
more
I
into
don't
God.
see that as being. I don't see that as being like incentivized necessarily. I think of that as like tit for tat or payback or something like that. I guess so.
Nah,
That's an
Maybe
interesting
we
way
are all
to put it.
motivated by
looking at it.
incentive. As human beings, are all motivated by an incentive. That's just if we didn't have that, we would have no desire to do anything. There has to be an incentive.
Yes and no. I mean,
I don't agree. Yeah.
if you're a soldier, what's your incentive to charge a machine gun nest? It's not really, some greater reward that you're really getting here. It's nothing beyond, a sense of love and fidelity and, comradeship that you have, that you're willing to lay down your life for someone else. But how would you describe that in terms of incentive structure?
Because you're brought up with the ideal that your country is a standard of some sort of righteousness that you feel needs to be defended. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it.
Well, I would say
I got 2 sons in the military. I can tell
Yeah.
you that their incentive was because of their love of country, but they feel that this country is worth promoting and worth defending. All right. So they go out, they work, they go through all their training that they're going through to build up their abilities to be able to charge a machine gun nest.
But I would say that's more love that's closer to love than it is closer to an economic incentive. So
No, but I'm talking about incentive now. What motivates a person? There has to be a motivation.
Motivation. I agree. People act intentionally. They act, they do what they do for important decisions for a reason. That's right. But I don't think incentive is really the right way of putting it. Incentive sort of reduces everything to a certain quid pro quo or payoff.
Yeah, that's how I was seeing it. Yeah.
Yeah. When in reality, a lot of what you do that's important in life doesn't have a payout. There's no incentive. Like what's the incentive to spend so much money, so much time with children? I mean, put it that way.
The definition of incentive is one who is something that motivates or encourages one to do something. I mean, that's basically the definition of incentive.
Right, but the idea of incentive would be some kind of a reward. An ultimate payback. But I think there seems like there's a lot of things in life that happen simply because of a sacrificial self-gift that goes beyond expecting to receive something in return for your efforts. I mean, there's clearly something to be said for that too, right? If you bust your ass working for a company and because you're going for the higher job or top job that you have, that's an incentive structure. But I don't think that same kind of logic applies to, say, raising children or serving in the military, where you're putting your life on the line for virtual strangers. I think there's something kind of different going on there. That's how I would put it.
Dr. Brown, maybe Dr. Brown, on that point, Jesus had 2 things to say. First, he said, "Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." That you completely. Right.
Now, John might reply, well, that's so you could have treasure in heaven.
Exactly. So that's the other thing he said. That he did have an incentive. It's reward in heaven. That was, if you might want to call it, that's the.
Yeah. Right. But I still say that the type of reward and the type of sacrifice being asked is something that just doesn't fit in that well with the model of of economic incentives, which is kind of how we started this. I mean,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of my
Certainly.
thought as well.
Yeah,
that's what I would say.
We see incentive as material incentive. Yeah.
Right. You're not going to literally get more money in heaven.
No.
Maybe you'll get a higher place in heaven, right? So, and I guess in some way you could you could say that's an incentive. But here's the thing. I remember getting this discussion once about someone with indulgences, and you know,
Oh, yeah.
arguing that
Good one.
indulgences were kind of like an incentive to to do good. And my point is that, well, it seems to me that indulgences are kind of almost kind of a really, really low level way to sort of get people in the habit of doing certain activities, which hopefully they will carry on, or they would do even if there were no indulgence at all. In other words, you don't really hear saints when they're doing heroic acts of mercy or goodness or doing martyrdom. You don't hear them talking about indulgences, right? I've never heard a saint really talking extensively about It seems like indulgences are things that you sort of push on people who are really just sort of starting their walk in the faith, hoping that they'll develop the habits of making small sacrifices here and there, with the idea of ultimately making much larger ones that are not even connected to necessarily a promise of it's not time off in purgatory, of course, but it would be more like a remission of temporal punishment of sin or whatever. So I just don't know that that the incentive thing it really captures what's going on with the Christian life, to me anyway.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
So, but anyway, yeah, come down to DC for the gala, John, and we'll talk about capitalism and how it could be improved.
No, I'm not saying it can't be improved. There's nothing perfect. However, the people who have prospered the most are those who have been involved in a capitalistic country, whether it was Europe or America or Canada.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it just goes for a reason. I mean, that's just fact. I mean,
yeah.
You know, when you have all things in common, and they tried that in the early church, obviously it didn't work. Otherwise, you'd still be doing it. Unless you live in a religious community or monastery.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that's maybe that form of living is not sustainable for most people most of the time. That's right. But of course, I mean, I think it's pretty accurate to say, though, that even in the tradition of the church, which has been through many centuries of thinking about economics and wealth, that the idea of wealth is clearly a mixed blessing at best, right? Getting more financial rewards for something is good on one level, but carries with it an awful lot of spiritual and moral hazards that cannot be ignored. So
and obligation too.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Yeah.
Right, and I also say that if you're relying on wealth to get you out of to lead a better life, in other words, making it your God, then that in itself becomes evil.
Yeah, right.
It's not God's anti-money, because actually the Bible speaks quite a bit about money, not always in a negative, but how to actually take care of it and be a good steward of it. It's when you put it before God that you feel that's your God, which is what really Jesus is talking about.
Right.
It's that you rely on your money is going to get you out of all problems in life.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Money in itself is not evil, and the Bible even says that. And it's the love of money It's not money is the root of all evil. It's the
love
love of money.
Yeah, the love of money is the root of all evil. Yeah. Well, that's good. That sounds like a good MA thesis for you to do, John. The New Testament teaching on money.
On capitalism.
On capitalism.
Yeah, on capitalism. Yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to go back and have you read and comment on some of Aquinas's teachings on, in sort of the high Middle Ages on wealth and pricing, the morality of setting prices and stuff. There's a whole discussion that happened before the modern age in terms of the morality of setting prices and raising prices in a shortage. Those are things that the medievals talked about quite a bit.
Right, because now you're taking advantage of people.
Yeah, but of course, if you're a true capitalist, you would say, well, the high price is good because it sends a signal for people producing that good to produce more of it, and thereby eliminating the shortage and thereby producing the greatest good gains for everybody. So therefore it's better to not to try to after a hurricane to force gas companies to sell gas for $1.50 a gallon or whatever, $2.20 a gallon, whatever they charge normally. It'd be better to charge it more, and that way people also buy less too. It's also a signal people should buy less. So it's a signal for producers to produce more and consumers to consume less, and that's how you alleviate the shortage. That does much more efficiently than you or I trying to intervene and resetting what the price should be, based on our instinct or intuition.
Yeah, I agree.
That'd be kind of a Hayekian argument, but obviously there's a lot of little twists on that you can get into that make it an interesting moral discussion and maybe other contexts. In terms of the buying and selling of goods. There's a interesting discussion for sure on capitalism and what wealth creation and Christian teaching, which obviously is a kind of a fairly open area because it's something that's which there's not been a whole lot of development theologically, but there has been a lot of development in terms of the discussion outside the church. So a lot of work could be done there.
Right.
So, well, anyway, we probably should wind down here, 8:50. Yep. So, good talking to you all.
Good talking to you.
Good talking here.
All right. And so, so I open up a discussion forum as well so we can talk about, if you guys want to talk about the modernists at all or anything like that. So some of this is maybe new to you. I don't know if you guys knew much about the Catholic modernists. But before, obviously they're pretty important in terms of how the church responded to a lot of the stuff around the turn of the century. And, in many ways, their existence was, sort of pestiferous because, they really sort of caused a reaction around some of the new methods and the newer assumptions that was maybe not warranted, but unfortunately was kind of associated with them, and so there was really no way to see that it would be anything different than that. So at any rate, let me know what you think about them or what you think about Joseph Marie de Lagrange. We did a little bit Lagrange. We did a little bit talk a little bit about him. The encyclicals, of course, very interesting. Providentissimus, Divino.
Yep.
Those are very important encyclicals, especially Divino. Divino really is in many ways a roadmap to Vatican II. So, any rate, so let me know what you think about it all, and then we'll chat more. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
see you guys
Brand.
later.
Thank
Yep,
you.
take
All right.
care. Have a
Bye-bye.
good night.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good
Bye.
night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.